Okay, welcome back, everyone. How was your weekend? Good. All right. Cool. Okay, so this is part 4 of this short course on Radiance Fields in Visual Computing and AI. Let's do a quick recap of where we are. So we've done 3 parts so far where we've talked about Radiance Fields, we've talked about how to capture radiance fields, how to encode radiance fields using neural networks first. So that was neural radiance fields, NERF. Then we talked about 3D Gaussian splatting in the previous lecture. Let's do a quick recap. I mean, the two lectures this week, today and on Wednesday, are going to be on slightly advanced topics, more research-oriented and more perhaps application and industry-oriented. So that's what I'll try to do in today's lecture on Wednesday's lecture. So that's going to be applications and the bleeding edge. I'm also going to do a little bit of a poll at the end of today's lecture to see what topics are most interesting for you so that I can focus on that for the next one. Okay, let's do a quick recap, a quick 1-minute recap of what we've seen so far. So the first thing that we learned was light fields, which we represent using the plenoptic function. So what is a light field? A light field tells us at all points in the scene, in all directions, what is the integrated radiance. That's what the light field captures, right? If you know the light field perfectly, it's an idealized function. It's impossible to capture it perfectly everywhere, right? What we try to do is to get approximations of the light field. That's what we do in practice, right? And if you do that, then you're able to know how the world looks like from any viewpoint using any kind of camera. You can use a zoom camera or a not wide-angle camera, right? And you can replicate how that camera would see the world, right? So if you have the light field, you have everything there is to know about how the scene looks like, okay? All right, then we talked about radiance fields. So radiance field, given a position and a direction, a radiance field captures not the integrated radiance, but the radiance at a certain point, just that point. So if you have a radiance field, which is what we have when we build a NERF or 3D Gaussian splat, we need to do the integration, right? So that's what we talked about last time. So this is known as volume rendering. And the way volume rendering works is you have a scene, you have a radiance field of a scene, and if you'd like to figure out what the camera sees, you shoot a ray. That ray intersects the scene at various different points. You query your underlying radiance field, either if it's a NERF or if it's a 3D Gaussian splat, that tells you what that radiance is. And then you use this integral equation, accumulate the radiance across the ray, that tells you what the integrated radiance should be at this pixel in our image. Okay? So that's volume rendering. Then we talked about NERF, which stands for neural radiance fields, which is a way to capture the radiance field, right? So what does NERF do? We train a fully connected neural network. That neural network takes as input spatial position and a viewing direction that tells us what point in the scene and what direction we are looking at. And the network is trained to output radiance expressed as RGB color and some kind of an opacity value that tells you how transparent, how opaque things are. Okay? So the NERF doesn't change volume rendering. You still do volume rendering like you would in the previous slide, right? All that it does is it gives us a way to encode the radiance field, right? It tells us at this particular position, if I'm looking in a certain direction, I know what the value of the radiance should be, what the value of LS should be. Okay, so that's kind of what NERF gives us. Then we talked about, okay, so NERF is a category of methods that we would call implicit representations. Implicit because the value of the radiance is not stored explicitly, it's stored inside the weights of the neural network, which you have to train. Once you've trained this successfully, then you can query the neural network to extract what the values are. So therefore, this is known as implicit representation. Then we talked about 3D Gaussian splatting, which is an explicit representation. What does 3D Gaussian splatting do? Given a scene, we represent that scene using hundreds of thousands of Gaussian functions represented using this 3D ellipsoid here, right? Each Gaussian has a bunch of parameters. So first we have the Gaussian function parameters. So that's the mean, covariance, right? So we have all of that. But in addition, we also have things like opacity and color, right? Which tells us something about the radiance at that particular point in the neighborhood of that Gaussian function, okay? So we take the scene represented using a hundreds of thousands of Gaussians, and that tells us what the radiance should be. So rather than query at every single point along the ray, this representation is somewhat sparse, right? Where there is no object, we don't put any Gaussians. So it's somewhat sparser than the other representation. And because it's explicit, you don't have to do a forward pass of your neural network. You can simply just go to that Gaussian and look up its opacity and color value. That directly gives you the radiance value, right? Then you can do this integration. So that was the advantage. This is called an explicit representation because you explicitly store the parameters of the Gaussian function, which you can easily look up, right? All right, so these are the two most common representations used for radiance fields. Now, I should caution you that there's like so many variants of both neural radiance fields as well as 3D Gaussian splatting. In practice, you don't actually use these methods. You use like more advanced methods that build on top of this, right? But for the sake of this discussion, we're going to limit ourselves to NeRF and 3D Gaussian splatting. And in fact, 3D Gaussian splatting is actually quite good. So although there are better versions of it, people routinely use 3D Gaussian splatting in various downstream applications. So, the quality of this is pretty good. So you can use this as is. Yeah.
So last class you mentioned that it renders much faster. Does it train much faster also compared to?
It's a little bit hard to do this comparison because NeRF was a few years ago, and since then GPUs have become better. In general, the answer is yes. If you have the same hardware, the same scene, the same number of images, this definitely trains faster than NeRF. But there's also variants of NeRF like Instant NGP, TensorRF, and so on, which also train faster. So, it depends on what you're comparing with exactly. All right, and it's useful to think about, so yeah, as you pointed out, rendering is real time with 3D Gaussian splatting, but training or optimization isn't real time on any of these methods. In fact, there is currently no method or just maybe one method that can train in real time, right? So there are no methods that can optimize or train the scene in real time. It's still an expensive process. It takes anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes per scene to get this 3D Gaussian splat. Did anybody get a chance to try the 3D Gaussian splat repo as part of the homework assignment? No? You did?
Sir, I tried 3D Gaussian splatting using Photoslab.
Okay.
And it was like modeling in real time also, like on the examples.
Sorry, what did you use? A photo?
Photoslab.
Photoslab. Okay.
It's a paper in CVTR. It's based on 3D Gaussian splatting. It uses different optimizers.
I see. Okay. Yeah, maybe we can discuss more offline. All right, sounds good. So that's a quick recap of what we've seen so far. Today we are going to look at how we can use the radiance field representation for downstream tasks. Okay. I was hoping to cover a few different downstream tasks, but in the end, I'm focusing on dynamic scenes and capturing hand grasping because these are the most. We can kind of dive more into the detail, but there are many more applications, maybe robotics and so on, which if you're interested, I can talk about in the next lecture. But for today, I'll focus on two applications of using radiance fields for applications beyond just novel view synthesis, which is what they were originally designed for. Okay. All right. So radiance fields. We talked about it in the first two lectures. I like to think of radiance fields as capturing two important things about the world: shape and appearance. Okay. Most of the motivation for developing radiance fields has been appearance. People want to do novel view synthesis. They want to be able to look at perspectives of the scene, which we don't have images for, right? And we want to do a good job for those perspectives, right? But then the applications go beyond just that, beyond just novel view synthesis. Particularly because they also capture something about the shape of the world, right? How the world looks is also a function of the shape of things in the world, right? And because they capture shape, this can be used for many other applications as well, right? And we'll talk about one such application today. We'll also talk about dynamic scenes, which is not just, so far we've only focused on static scenes. What happens if you have things that are moving, right? How do you capture this efficiently? So that's something that we'll talk about today as well. Okay, any other questions so far before we dive into the details? Yeah.
So when we combine both the dynamic scene and the and multiple cameras, right? Say for example, single camera that is moving. So
yeah.
Under that circumstance, how would things work? Because by the time we move to a different viewpoint, the view would have changed, so that leads to some kind of hole in the in the original field.
So there's different kinds of settings when you're talking about dynamic scenes. You can have single moving camera and moving scene. So that's the setting that you're talking about. But you could also have moving scene, but multiple static cameras that are now capturing videos of the scene.
And they should be synchronized.
And they should be synchronized, yes. So that is another setting. That's what we'll talk about today.
Okay.
But the setting that you're talking about is monocular dynamic scenes,
Yes.
right? So monocular moving camera dynamic scenes. That is another setting. As you said, there are you need priors there because you can't always replicate. You don't always have multiple views for the same time instant, right? So that's something that's an issue there. We won't talk about that much now, but if you're interested, I'm happy to talk about it for the next lecture. Yeah. All right. Okay, so first we're going to talk about capturing hand grasps. Okay, so grasping and manipulation is something that as humans we do naturally, right? So think about it, like how many objects have you touched since waking up this morning, right? It's probably like in the hundreds of objects, right? In fact, there's a really nice book called Everything We Touch, which is a kind of a art project where the author captured all the objects that a person touches on an average day, and they have like 100 different people, right? This is just one such example. So the person touches laptops, lots of clothing, looks like they live in a fairly cold country, gloves, things like that, right? Stroller, looks like they have a child, right? So you get a sense of the person's daily activities just by looking at this, right? Grasping and manipulating these objects requires a lot of dexterity. I mean, we don't yet have robots that can do household chores, right? Like let's say you want a robot that makes dinner for you, right? We don't yet have that. And one of the reasons for this is because manipulation and grasping, which are very essential for doing these kinds of activities, it is very hard to do, right? Humans are very good at it. Robots are not very good at it. Even animals aren't very good at it, right? So, that's one of the things we want to study as part of, many things we want to do in AI, right? So let's look at how grasping happens, right? So this is an example of a person grasping a coffee mug by its handle. So that's what they did here. So what are all the things that happen when a person grabs this coffee mug, right? So first of all, if you want to understand this grasp, we need to know something about the articulation of the fingers. So we need to know what is the pose of the hand, what are the ways in which the articulation of the fingers change in order to grasp that finger. We need to know that, right? We need to know something about the object. We need to know what the shape of the object is, so we know where the handle of the coffee mug is. We need to know the texture, whether it's slippery or if it's rough. We need to know something about the weight, fragility, and so on and so forth. Right? So all of these pieces of information help us determine how to grasp an object. So those are all essential pieces of information. So if you eventually want robots to do this kind of grasping and manipulation activities, we have some knowledge from which to build upon. Right? So that's the idea. Now, in addition to all of this, there's also how the hand contacts the object. So where do you grasp the object? How do you know which part of your fingers touch the object, which parts of the object touch your finger, right? So there's lots of other questions as well. How much force to apply? And then finally, what is my goal? What am I trying to do with this coffee mug, right? Am I trying to drink coffee out of it, or am I putting it back on a shelf, right? So all of these different goals will result in like different ways in which we grasp objects, right? So there's lots of things to capture. So if you want to capture grasps so that we can eventually build robots that can learn from those captured grasps, we need to capture aspects of all of these things, right? So that's our goal. Now, there's been a lot of work in trying to capture these kinds of grasps, right, in the computer graphics and computer vision community. Most of these methods use some kind of mesh-based representation. So a mesh is a 3D model. You can think of it as of the hand and of the object, right? And what people try to do is they try to set parameters for these 3D models so that we can capture how the person is grasping a particular object, right? So you can do these kinds of things. But the limitation with these approaches is that because these meshes are some kind of a low-dimensional representation of the actual hand of the object, it often results in misalignments. So here you can see the blue mesh here doesn't perfectly align with the fingers, right? So you have the same problem here and over there as well, right? Now, this is an issue because if you don't capture the surface of the hand really accurately, then you don't know where contact is made. Even if you're off by like a centimeter, contact will be completely incorrect, right? So that's a bit of an issue. Was there a question here?
So previous one.
Yeah.
Are all you said that we need to capture all these properties, sir. Are we capturing all of these properties from the image itself? Image only, sir? Image
Right. Good question. Yeah, good question. So, I'm not saying anything about that yet, right? So I'm just saying that we need to know these properties, right? But obviously, we want to capture these properties without easily. We want to capture these properties easily, right? So if you require expensive like tactile sensors and gloves and things like that, it's very expensive to capture this, right? So it seems like if you have cameras, you can do this easily, right? So and that's the connection with Radiance Fields, right? I'm going to get to that in a moment, which is we're going to capture many of these properties using just cameras, right? So that's our goal. Okay, so yeah, there's a bunch of limited. Yeah, Rajiv, question.
So if you think of the model shape to occupancy, right? I mean, what would be a fundamental way in which we could model many of these properties, right? Say texture and any of these properties.
Yeah, so I think for things to do with the shape and the appearance, so that includes pose of the hand, contact surface, object shape, maybe object appearance, right? I think my argument is that Radiance fields are pretty good for that, right? So that's the argument. But for things like weight and fragility, it's much harder to use Radiance fields for that. But nonetheless, because if you use 3D Gaussian splatting, as I will show here, you can associate arbitrary pieces of information to the Gaussians, right? So you could have something to do with the weight, you could do something with fragility and so on, right? So I actually think that the 3D Gaussian splat representation is actually really well suited for just assigning arbitrary pieces of information, right? But definitely for shape and appearance, I think Radiance fields are pretty good. Yeah. All right, any other questions? Okay. So I think it's kind of a bit of a, we've spoiled the fun already, right? So we're going to use Radiance fields to capture some of these properties. That's why I'm talking about this in this course. And the idea here is that, remember the issue that I pointed out with previous approaches, which is these misalignments, right? They are less of an issue with Radiance fields because Radiance fields fundamentally, if you look at the loss function, we talked about the loss function, right? So you do volume rendering, you get your images, and you compare your images with the ground truth, which means that volume rendering has to result in pixel perfect color, right? It has to result in pixel perfect color of that particular, of that particular ray, right? If you don't have perfect color, this is going to result in misalignments in the Radiance field fitting, right? So that means that Radiance fields are pretty well suited for fixing these kinds of misalignments. So if you had some kind of a Radiance field representation of the hand and the object, and then your loss was based on a similar comparison with the ground truth, right? You would get rid of some of the pixel alignment issues that we see here with these template-based or mesh-based representations, right? So that's the idea. And the second thing is photorealism. So not only do you capture things in the world well, but you also can photorealistically replicate things. So if you capture a grasp, you can then change the grasp, maybe change the object. You have some other object, right? You can make your hand grasp that other object, right? So those are things that you can do as well. So, the hypothesis here is that Radiance fields are pretty good for the problem that we're talking about here, which is hands grasping objects. And we want to capture this in high quality detail. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is, rather than trying to capture all of these different properties, we're going to focus on properties that are related to the shape and appearance of the object. So we're going to care about hand pose. So hand pose meaning hand articulations, contact surfaces, and object shape, right? And this was work that was led by Chandradeep, who was visiting my lab a couple of years ago. And this was at CVPR this year. Or, well, not this year anymore, last year, 2024. Okay, and we are going to use Gaussian splatting as the base representation here, because Gaussian splats have some very nice properties, and I'll talk about what those nice properties are. Okay, so if you want to capture something about the object and the hand, we're going to need to describe all of this using Radiance fields, right? So that's our goal. So let's start with the object because it's easy. The objects are rigid, they don't deform, they don't articulate, right? So let's start with something like that, right? Okay, so let's say we have a bunch of books here, and the person is trying to grasp this book. We'd like to understand what are the finger articulations, what is the position of the book, where contact is made between the book and the hand. Okay, so that's our goal. Now for the book, what we're going to do is we're going to draw some inspiration from 3D Gaussian splatting. We're going to represent it as a collection of 3D Gaussian functions, right? So each dot that you see here at this point cloud-like representation represents a 3D Gaussian, okay? And this has a bunch of parameters, same as what we've seen before, right? So we have mean, covariance, opacity, and spherical harmonics for view-dependent color, okay? So exactly the same as what we've seen so far. What we then do is splatting. Remember the snowball, right? So you take your snowball, throw it at a wall, right? That splats. That's exactly the rasterization process here, right? And that gives you an image, which you could then compare with your ground truth. We are now assuming that this whole scene, let me go back to this. You see the scene here, like where the hand grasps the object. Let me see if, you see the scene where the hand grasps this object. We are assuming that this entire scene is being captured simultaneously by a bunch of cameras around it. Okay, so you can actually see a bit of those cameras here. Over here, you see these black little things there. Those are all cameras that are observing this particular scene. Okay, so that's the setting. So we're not looking at the monocular dynamic setting. We're looking at the static cameras, but dynamic scene setting. Okay, and there are cameras all around. And I'll talk about this capture system in a few slides. Okay, so for rigid objects, we can create reconstructions like the one that you see on the right. All right. So that looks pretty good. It's a pretty faithful reconstruction of the collection of books that we have in the scene, right? And this is just using exactly the same 3D Gaussian splatting technique that we've talked about, right? But rather than worry about everything else that is in the scene, we are only focusing on the books, only on the object of interest. Okay? So this is exactly the same as before. Even the loss function is the same. So we use the L1 loss function, then we have structural similarity, and we have an additional loss function, which makes these Gaussians look more like spheres rather than like ellipsoids. It turns out that this has some advantages when we are trying to find contact, okay? So that's the only other additional loss function there. Everything else is exactly the same as before. Okay, so that's the object, pretty straightforward. But what about the hand? Because the hand can articulate, right? Our fingers can move. So far, the radiance field representation that we've talked about only does static scenes. So if things change in the world, we don't know how to model that, right? So let's see how we can represent the hand, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to capture the hand in some kind of a canonical pose. So let's say I spread out my fingers like this, and I take a picture with all my cameras, right? Then I follow the regular 3D Gaussian splatting strategy, exactly the same as before, like for what we would do for the object, right? And what I create is a 3D Gaussian splat representation of my static hand. Okay? What we then do is we take a kinematic skeleton. So skeleton is, for those of you who are not familiar, skeleton is like, think of your bones, right? Your bones are the structure that you use to articulate your body, right? So it's kind of like that. So this image here represents the bones of the hand, right? And what you can do, and this is something that's done in computer animation, is you can change the position of the bone, so you can articulate the bones. You can somehow connect points on the hand, so the 3D Gaussians, attach those 3D Gaussians to the bones, so that when you move the bones, the Gaussians move with it, right? So this process is called skinning. So you skin the Gaussians to the underlying skeleton, and then when you drive the skeleton, the Gaussians move with it. Okay? So that's what we do here. So we take something that looks like bones of the hand, then we connect every single 3D Gaussian in the static hand pose to these bones, and then when I change the pose or the articulation of the bones, the Gaussians move with it. Okay? So this is how we are making a static 3D Gaussian model into a dynamic 3D model, right? So what this effectively means is the radiance field changes as my bones move, right? So I can make it move as the hands move, okay? So what we get is what we call an articulated 3D Gaussian splatting model. So now you can change the bones, the position of the bones or the orientation of the bones, and the hand will change together with it as well. The appearance of the hand will change together with it as well, right? And the rest of the process is exactly the same. Splatting, rasterization, exactly the same as before, okay? Even the loss function is exactly the same. Again, we have some additional term here, which makes the hand look more realistic. So this is a perceptual loss. The first two loss functions are exactly the same as before. The third one is exactly the same as the object case, right? We add an additional perceptual loss to make the hand look perceptually similar to the input images. Okay? And then we get a bunch of data of the hand in different poses, and then we train this model. Okay? So that's our articulated 3D Gaussian splatting model. Question? Yeah.
So basically what's happening here is that earlier, in Gaussian, there was just one single scenery, static, different cameras.
So you had lots of images,
No,
but static scene.
The
Yeah.
scene was static, but
Correct.
there were a lot of photos of different angles.
Correct, yeah.
But now like, what we have is one level advanced.
Yeah.
The scene itself is
Moving. Yes, correct. You're right, yeah. You still have lots of images, right? But the scene itself is moving. In this case, the scene is just the hand, right? We don't care about anything else that's moving. We'll talk about that next. Yeah.
and as long as like this hand is moving, so for each pose there will be like different Gaussians.
Okay, so that's the thing. It's not different Gaussians. It's the same set of Gaussians. Okay? But the Gaussians move as the fingers move.
So like the value would be different.
The position of the Gaussians are different, right? Everything else remains the same. Right? The color remains the same, opacity remains the same, orientation remains the same. But as the bones move, the position of the Gaussians move. Actually, orientation moves as well, but that's a detail. Yeah.
So in the previous slide, when you were doing for objects, the object is rigid, but it
Yeah.
can move in time. So,
In this case, we are assuming that the object is just rigid, it doesn't move at all. Right? We are just interested in grasping. We're not interested in manipulation. So we just want to know, if I have this bottle here, I assume that the bottle is static. I'm going to grab it, and then I'm going to release it. I want to know which part of the finger made contact with which part of the bottle. Question?
The hand movement itself is non-rigid, right? So, would the Gaussian's properties change when we move, say, from this position to say this position?
Yes, because the Gaussians, we are doing the skinning thing, right?
Yeah.
So what that means is that the Gaussian position changes and its orientation changes as well.
Okay. So,
But the color, opacity, those don't change.
okay. So when you see the orientation, it's basically the covariance matrix.
The covariance matrix,
Okay.
yeah. And that is related to the bones here, so how the bones move. All right, so that's an articulated 3D Gaussian. You can use the same idea for full body modeling as well, right? So this is for hands, but then if you had a whole person in there, you could replace this with the skeleton of an entire person, and you could follow the same strategy to capture an entire person. Okay, so that's something that we can do as well. All right, let's look at some results. So these are there you go. Yeah. So these are real. These are my students' hands, actually, right? 3 of my students who were authors on the paper, right? They captured their hands, right? And you can see different articulations of the hands. You can change the fingers, move the fingers, right? And you will see how the hand looks like from these different articulations.
The number of Gaussians stays the same.
The number of Gaussians is exactly the same. Yeah. So we don't change that at all. So we have to fit it once before, and then we just keep it as is. That's the advantage. You don't have to change the number of Gaussians every single time, right? And again, here the rendering is real time, right? So you can change the articulations and see how the hand looks like from these different poses. All right. Okay. Now we are not done yet. We've captured the object. We've captured the hand. But we also want to know where the hand makes contact with the object, which parts of the object touch the fingers, right? We want to know these things. How do we do that? Now remember, when we talked about radiance fields, there's always 2 things that they capture: appearance and shape, right? So far we've only focused on the appearance. How does this look like a reasonable appearance, right? But contact is actually a function of the geometry of the shape, right? So what is the shape of my finger? What is the shape of my object? If I know that, then I can know where contact is being made between these 2 things, right? So we're going to make use of this idea to use the same data that we have to capture grasps as well, or contact points in grasps as well, okay? So yeah, so we have Manus' hand, which tells us what the shape of the hand is, what the appearance of the hand is in different finger articulations. Then we have the object reconstruction as well, right? We are then going to capture a lot of sequences using the same capture system where the hands grasp the object, okay? And once we've done that, this looks like this, right? So here you can see at t equals 2 seconds, this hand is grasping these books over here, Right? We want to know what parts of the hand are in contact with what parts of the object. Okay? What we then do is we build these kinds of heat maps solely based on distance between Gaussians. So we're going to take Gaussians on the object. We're going to take all the Gaussians in the hand at that particular time instant. We're going to find distances between all combinations of Gaussians, right? And we're going to take Gaussians that have a distance of less than some threshold, let's say 1 millimeter, right? And we're going to label them as contact Gaussians, okay? And that is what this heat map shows us. This heat map shows us not just contact, but also how much the distance is between the Gaussians, right? So if you see very bright, it means that the distance is very small. If you see very dark, then it means that the distance is quite large, okay? And we are going to use this as a proxy for contact, right? We're going to say that this heat map represents some measure of contact between the hand and the object. So that's the idea here. So this shows you that radiance fields are not just about making things look nice from different perspectives, but it's more than that, right? So you can actually capture three-dimensional structure of the scene, and you can use that structure to reason about things like contact that you see here. Okay? Now, this is what we call instantaneous contact. So that's the contact that is made at t equals 2 seconds, right? But then when we are grasping an object, contact changes. Initially, we might contact one part, then other part, and then when we release contact, right? So we can also get what are known as accumulated contacts. So that's in the process of the entire grasp over the entire sequence, what are all the parts of the hand that come into contact with the object, right? So we can do that kind of accumulation as well. Okay, so this is how we get contacts using radiance fields, or in this particular case, it's 3D Gaussian splats. Yeah, so this column here represents instantaneous contact. So that means that at t equals 2 seconds, this was the contact that was being made. At t equals 4 seconds, this was the contact that is being made. What you're seeing here is accumulated contact also across different time instances. So at t equals 4, more parts of the hand have touched the object, right? That's why you see more of this heat map here, right? But at t equals 2 seconds, only some parts of the hand have come into contact with the object, right? So it's kind of you can think of this as a cumulative. You take all of these heat maps and then just do a union of all of them. Does that make sense?
Like accumulated means the total make contact with the object. Like
So from beginning to that particular time instant, what are all the parts of the hand that have come into contact with the object, right? Yeah.
So how are we going to describe how the hand is going to capture the books or object? That is that we are giving it.
How are we
priori.
describing? What do you mean by that?
If we have hand and we have an object, we have to grasp it also for that. There should be a planning for it to go. And
Oh, but these are real people grasping the object, right? So the planning is in your brain essentially, right? So this is not yet robotics. Like we are not yet doing robots. So the idea is that if you can capture a lot of these grasps, so let's say you capture billions of these grasps, right? You can use that information to then train a robot that reasons from this data, right? But for now, we are assuming that there is some intelligent, planning mechanism, control mechanism that goes behind this grasping. In this case, that's just humans.
So human will hold that object, and these from the cameras by using the radiance fields, we will be obtaining these heat maps as contact points.
Exactly.
Those will be approximately same as the sensors that we touched.
Yeah, in fact, this turns out to be more accurate. I'll talk about that in a moment. Yeah.
So in your setup, you estimate the hand separately, and then you feed these kinds of videos, or is everything done?
Yeah, in this particular example, we were doing it separately. Like fit the hand, fit the object, then we fit the sequence. But in some more recent work, we are trying to do everything together jointly. But that'll probably be more accurate. That's our hypothesis. Yeah. Yeah.
So, two questions. First one, how do we handle the occlusion? Because there could always be some moment where all the positions, or rather, all the cameras would not be able to see a particular point, and then that would lead to some kind of a confusion whether that object is in contact with the hand or not.
Mm-hmm.
And second question, how do we measure the accuracy of this?
Yes, great question. The second question I'll get to. For the first question, we have a lot of cameras. Okay, so in fact, we have 50 cameras for this particular setup, and I'll talk about the setup in a moment, right? So that's a lot of cameras. You have a lot of views, right? So occlusions are fairly minimal. There's also a second thing that prevents occlusion from being a big issue, which is that we reconstruct the hand separately without any occlusion. So we do this kind of spread out fingers. So there is no occlusion, right? And then later, you don't actually have to reconstruct the hand again. You only need to know the articulations of the fingers, right?
Okay.
So even if there is occlusion, you still have the articulation of the fingers. So that is sufficient actually to reason under that kind of occlusion, right? So that helps. But yeah, for the accuracy, I'll get to that in a couple of slides. Was there another question here?
Sir,
Yeah.
how do you know that which point of hand contacted which point of the book?
So we take all the 3D Gaussians that are part of the hand, all the 3D Gaussians that are part of the object, do a n squared distance between them, right? In practice, we do something simpler, but that's how you would do it. If you want to be perfectly 100% sure, right? So you do an n squared, all the Gaussians of the hand, all the Gaussians of the object, find the distance, right? L2 distance, and then we pick the one that's nearest in this case. Okay, all right. So let's look at some results. These are real graphs. So this is how the videos look like, right? So this is, again, I think Chandradeep doing these kinds of motions, right? So you capture all of this. And then what you're seeing here is the reconstruction of the appearance. So this is just novel view. So you kind of see the camera rotating, right? So we're using exactly the same technique as in radiance field rendering, volume rendering, basically, right? To get these kinds of images. And over here, you're seeing contact. So when the hand gets close to this Rubik's Cube, you see these parts of the finger light up, right? So that means that contact is being made in those parts of the finger, right? And you can do this. You can also get the accumulated contacts, like what we discussed earlier. Okay, so yeah, question.
So is there a metric to like how accurate?
Yes, I will get to that. The accuracy question is actually quite interesting. So that's my next slide actually. But before that, let's talk about the capture system itself. Okay, capturing data like this for grasps is actually quite challenging. There's no data set that we could just use off the shelf. So together with students in my group, we actually built a capture system ourselves, right? This capture system kind of looks like this box that you see here. It's about 1 meter cube capture volume. There are cameras on all sides. So there are 6 sides. So this is a cube. The cube has 6 sides. There are cameras on all sides of the cube. In total, there are 9 cameras per side. We can have up to 54 cameras in this entire capture system. All the data that I showed you is captured using around 51 cameras. There's also a transparent shelf where you can put objects, and there are cameras under, above, left, right, front, back. Okay, so there's cameras literally everywhere, and you can see how that looks like over here. Okay. This is actually also a light stage. So we also have LEDs that are controllable. You can control the color, you can control things like that, right? But that's not what we're using here. So yeah, we built this completely in-house so that we can capture this kind of grasping data. Question?
Why are there microphones?
Yes, I will talk about this in the second half because radiance fields are not just for light. You can also use this for audio. So we can do that too. So we use microphones as well.
So we need to calibrate them every time you open the door and keep an object?
Yes, unfortunately. You have to calibrate it every single time. But it's not too hard. Yeah. We use markers, but we can also do it without markers. So it's actually not too bad. We also built like room scale versions of this, right? So we have an entire room full of cameras, about 100 cameras that we now have since this project. And that calibration is a little bit easier because we can use call map, structure for motion, for doing that kind of calibration. All right, let's skip through this. Are you guys interested in captures, the hardware that goes behind these capture systems? Because if you are, I can talk about this a little bit in the next lecture. If you're interested, just raise your hand, maybe. Okay, there's enough interest, so maybe I'll talk about that in the next lecture. So, if this is an example of what we can do with the room scale system, right? So once we built the room scale system, we can do reconstructions like this, right? This is a very early reconstruction. We have higher quality results now. That is actually Sudarshan, who's actually also in Bangalore, and he was visiting us last week as well. All right, so that's how we capture all the grasping data. Okay, so we took the entire, we used this kind of capture system to capture a lot of data, grasping data. I'll skip through some of the details here because I'm running a little bit late. But how do we get ground truth contact? I think that's the question that came up multiple times, right? So we need ground truth. What do we do, right? Well, we took inspiration from some very early work in the 80s on studying grasping. What they did was they painted objects in black paint. And then they had people grasp those objects, right? And the paint leaves behind some residue. You can then look at that residue. And this is ground truth contact because there is residue only when paint is exchanged between the object and the hand, right? So we do the same thing here. We are, of course, skipping through some of the, someone pointed out that paint is a fluid and therefore there's like issues with like fluid motion and so on. We're skipping through all that, right? So we're assuming that the paint just dries up as soon as it exchanges to the hand, right? So this is pretty good. It's very close to ground, right? We also use green paint because we can then use computer vision techniques to automatically segment out green screen backgrounds, right? So we can use chroma keying to segment out green from everything else. So that's exactly what we do, right? Then we can measure metrics that we are familiar with, segmentation metrics like IOU, intersection over union, mean intersection over union, right? So that's exactly what we do. We actually compare our method, which is the last column, with other methods, including mesh-based methods. And in the paper has more details, but essentially our method does a much better job. For those of you who worked with mean IOU, you might notice that this is actually a low value, right? It turns out that this is a very hard problem, and even the method that we are proposing isn't the best that you can do, right? You can do much better. We don't want to saturate the data set, right? So that's why we provide. But this is still much better than existing solutions. That's the point here. Okay, so far, this method can't handle articulated shapes. It's only for grasping. There's no manipulation involved, right? And this is limited to lab capture using this box that I showed you earlier, right? You can't do if you want to capture this in your kitchen, it's still it's not possible to do that yet. Right? So that's something that we want to look at in future work. All right. Any questions? Yeah.
So all this data is based on one hand, sir.
Just one hand, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Another person's hands will have different shape, maybe length and.
No, we have multiple people in this data set. We have 3 people, but it's only one hand at a time. You're right. So that's one of the limitations which I point out here. Like if you have 2 hands, then it's not possible to do that yet. Yeah.
Have you done some experiments on some non-rigid objects, like their shape can deform as?
Not in this work, but that's something that my students are working on. Like if you have deformable objects, non-rigid objects, how do you do the same thing there? I think that's still an open question.
So what is it?
So if you have, it's kind of like the first question. If your hand is different across people, then won't the skinning be different? And hence won't the hand be different?
And context.
Yeah, so we I didn't talk about this yet, but we have a procedure where it doesn't matter whose hand that is, right? We have a way to get the skinning weights automatically. So we use computer graphics techniques for doing that, automatic rigging and skinning methods. Okay, I'm running a little bit behind schedule, so I don't know how much of the next thing that I'm going to be able to cover, but I'll try to at least give you the high-level picture. Okay. So far what we've talked about is dynamic scenes, but then very specific dynamic scenes. Okay, you have the hand, you have an object. There are some limitations. You can have only one hand. It currently works on only rigid objects and so on and so forth, right? But general scenes like cooking or doing something like this involves a lot of dynamic activity. Any part of the scene might move, any part of the scene might change, right? So having Manus, the method that I talked about, doesn't really help us capture these kinds of scenes that might involve a lot of different kinds of dynamics. Okay, so how do we capture all of that, right? So there's been a lot of work. If you're interested, papers like DyNerf, NerfDS, HyperNerf, these are all examples of papers that use Nerf to capture dynamic scenes. So you might want to check them out. But even today, there are some, this slide is like a year old, but even today, there are some very difficult challenges for dynamic scenes. Okay, so there's not very good data sets that can help make progress in these kinds of problems. Most dynamic scenes are limited to like a few tens of seconds, usually around 15 seconds, right? Which is, cooking takes like an hour, right? So there's no data set that you can download that has so many different views for like this whole 1 hour thing, right? So it's very difficult to do. And then, the camera placement is also an issue. Most data sets are either forward facing. So if you have a scene like this, there are only cameras here. So you can't look at how the scene might look like from different positions, right? So that's something that you can't do, right? So that's a limitation. So yeah, there's plenty of data sets. This slide probably needs to be updated, but essentially, most of these data sets are limited by the number of views and the length of the data that they have, right? So we wanted to fix this. So what we did was, using the same setup that I talked about earlier, this box, we captured a lot of dynamic data, mostly of people doing different kinds of manipulation activities with their hands, or toys that move, children's toys essentially, right? Like cars and these kinds of toys and so on and so forth. Right? So we captured a lot of data. In fact, we captured something like 17 million images. So those are videos, but then in total, if you count them as images, there's 17 million images, and almost 3,000 seconds of multi-view data. Right? So we captured all of this. So our goal here, and this was work that was led by Cheng, Yu, Payson, and Angela, who are all students working in my lab. So we use the same capture system. The data looks something like this, right? Actually, let me see if audio plays. Maybe I have audio on the next slide. Okay. So this is the multi-view video that we capture. Okay, and this is synchronized. So one of the things with dynamic data is you need to take pictures at exactly the same time, right? If you don't take pictures at exactly the same time, you can't do the reconstruction anymore, right? So we have specialized hardware that helps us capture this kind of synchronized data. And we have a lot of data, so object-centric sequences, hand sequences, large-scale motion, small-scale motion, right? So we have all these different kinds of examples. And our goal here was not to build a method for this kind of dynamic reconstruction, but just to kind of build this data set that we and others can use to build dynamic reconstruction methods, right? So that was the goal here. All right, so once we have that, we then took off-the-shelf Radiance field reconstruction methods. So this is an example of instant NGP, which is a variant of NERF that is much faster. Then we can do this kind of reconstruction, right? So here the person is folding some kind of origami, and you can do novel view synthesis, right? So you can look at the scene from different perspectives here, right? And this is a dynamic scene, and we are doing it for every single frame. So what you're doing here is, rather than, in the previous case, we had a model, and the model would tell us how the hand deforms or articulates, right? But here we are treating every single frame of the video as one static radiance field. And then we're just reconstructing every single frame of the video, right? So that's a lot of different radiance fields put together, essentially. That's what you're looking at here. Okay, so more examples of the data. Yeah, you can actually hear audio there. Someone asked why we have microphones, right? So we're also collecting audio data. And we have 6 microphones that can help us capture spatial sound, right? Even for these kinds of toys. Right? And we also additionally have like text descriptions and things like that. Now, why do we care about audio? Well, it turns out that audio actually plays a pretty important role in the way we grasp and manipulate things. It turns out that in our brain, when we try to grasp an object, even if we didn't see anything, even if we could just hear the sound that we make when we touch things, right? That's actually sufficient signal to understand what kind of grasping activity is taking place, right? In other words, what this paper shows is that 15% of neurons involved in grasping and manipulation in our brains activate when we hear sounds of us performing those activities, right? So that's actually, there's a very strong correlation between audio and visual signals for grasping and manipulation. So that's why we recorded a lot of audio as well. Okay, yeah, so then you can start to benchmark, right? You can take different kinds of methods, and then you can try to compare different methods in this data set for long dynamic scenes, right? So we did a very detailed analysis. I will skip over that. We can talk about this later. So that's what this DIVA 360 data set does, right? So it provides this kind of long, dense camera view dynamic sequences that people can use to benchmark their methods. Now, one of the things here is, even today, methods for dynamic radiance field reconstruction, I mean, this work is almost 2 years old now, but even today, this remains an underexplored topic, right? Partly because we don't have, this is like a table scale data, but if you had room scale data, we don't yet have that, right? So that remains an underexplored problem. Question?
How the ground truth work on this dynamic object? Like that thing here.
We are not trying to capture contacts here. We're only trying to reconstruct the scene. This is just the data set, right? So we don't provide any kind of ground truth contact or anything like that. So it's difficult to paint these things and use the same technique, right? So we don't do that yet. So for now, this is just general data. This is not specific to hand grasping.
Each frame you train a static nerve or?
Yeah, static nerve, 3D Gaussian splatting, any of these methods, right? But every single frame is treated as a static scene. Yeah.
Can you use the previous time frames neural network for better?
Yeah, we tried many of those things. It turns out that just training every frame independently was far more efficient and much higher quality. Right? That was our big discovery here. Right? Like you have all these complicated methods, K-planes, mixed voxels, that claim to do better on dynamic scenes. But then in the end, if you just treat every single frame as a static frame and then do that reconstruction, the quality is much higher. Funnily enough, the computational overhead is also much lower. Right? So you're just better off doing a per frame estimation. But what you will lose is there'll be some flickering because it won't fit the same way every single frame. Right?
Smooth.
I mean, you don't see it much here, but if you look at the quantitative results, you see some up and down of the PSNR. So there is some noise with respect to what we call this jitter. It changes every frame. Okay, all right. So there's a bunch of limitations with this data set. Most importantly, it's limited to this kind of studio captured small tabletop setting. That's why we're building these bigger capture systems, so we can capture more natural kind of settings as well. All right, so I don't have a lot of time. So what I'm going to do is the last thing that I want to talk about is kind of like a fun application of Radiance Fields. So maybe I'll just go through it very quickly. Now, one of the things that people in the language, people who study language, one of the things that they do is they look at language acquisition in infants, right? So they look at how children learn language. There's been a lot of work, for example, the Human Speechome project from MIT by Debroy, and then the SACAM project by folks at Stanford, right? So there's been a lot of work in trying to capture audio data of children learning language as well as associated video data, right? So that you can correlate what children see when they learn a certain word and so on and so forth, right? So my lab studies grasping and manipulation. And it turns out that there's a lot of connection between language acquisition and motor skills acquisition, specifically grasping and manipulation. So our hypothesis was if you study language acquisition in children, we should also be studying motor skills acquisition in children, right? So that was our goal. And if you want to do something like this, you probably want to have lots of cameras. We think that Radiance Fields is a good technology because you don't have to put these kind of cameras on babies, right? You can have cameras in the environment and you can capture them in rich detail, right? So that was our hypothesis. And we thought that Radiance Fields were actually pretty good for doing something like this, right? Now, if you want to do studies with children, it's very complicated, right? You have to first get participants, you have to have good capture systems, you have to get approval from the ethics board of the university, and then you need to have experts who study this kind of motor acquisition skills to analyze all of this data, right? So it's a really complicated thing to do. Now, where we are is, we are somewhere over here in our research in my lab, right? So we've found a participant, we've managed to build a capture system to capture some data for that participant, but we are still working with experts to analyze this data and reconstruct this data and so on. Okay, yeah, so the participant was my son. My wife and I had he was born August of 23. I'm a computer vision guy. I'm like, okay, I now have this participant. What do I do with him? Right? So I built this capture cradle. This is a cradle where you can put an infant. It has 32 cameras designed exclusively for building Radiance Field reconstructions. It also has 8 microphones, so we can capture all the sounds that he's making, caregivers are making, and so on and so forth. It has a lot of features which I'm happy to talk about. So 32 cameras. There's a privacy controls, microphones, and we collect about 1 terabyte of data every day, which is then whisked away to servers at Brown. By the way, I built this whole thing in India actually because my son was born in India. So this was in Mumbai, and I had a fun time trying to get all the hardware in stores near the railway station in Thane. So it was a lot of fun. Okay, So I'm also happy to talk about all the privacy considerations that we thought about in building this system. We had IRB approval. The data is all stored in a secure server. It'll never be made public, right? So we went through a lot of that stuff. So here's some sample data. So here you can see 4 views out of the 32 cameras that we had. So this is an example. He was probably 3 months old, I want to say, in this particular clip. So he's doing these kinds of motor motions, right? Moving hands and feet. And you could kind of clearly see all of that, right? And we have 32 cameras, so you can actually do dynamic radiance field reconstruction as well if you wanted to. So there was no intervention. We were not doing anything to elicit certain kinds of motion from him. It was just, we would just put him in the crib and just press the button to record, and it would just record natural activities, right? So there was no intervention. We captured about an hour a day for the first 6 months. He's now too old for the crib. We don't capture data anymore. In total, we have something like 600 hours of audio and video, and over 300 million image frames of the first 6 months of this infant's life. So we believe he's probably the most photographed infant ever. Right? I tried applying for a Guinness World Record, but for some reason they won't accept it. All right, so I promised that there is a scientific motivation for this, right? So this is not just a fun family photo album, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to analyze how infants capture motor skills. So you can see that actually, let me play that again. So nobody told me this, but infants, when they're born, are pretty boring, right? So they don't move a lot. This is how infants are, or this particular infant is at around 20 days, right? Not much motion. At about 25 days, you start to see more uncoordinated kind of motion of the hands and the feet. And at about 48 days, he starts to develop, looking at faces. He starts to attend to faces, right? So here he's looking at a face, a caregiver, right? And he's kind of looking at their face, attending to faces, right? So he's capable of doing that. At about 65 days, he starts to attend things like toys. And also, we start to see the development of hand-eye-mouth coordination, which is pretty important. So he starts to put his hand in his mouth, right? That's actually a pretty important milestone for grasping, manipulation, and generally for motor development, right? Yeah, so because we have this kind of longitudinal data, you can kind of analyze it across different time periods, and we are working with cognitive scientists to see what kind of knowledge we can gain from this kind of data, right? And our hope is that we want to build radiance fields, right? So we want to build dynamic radiance fields. So we have 32 cameras. We can build reconstructions like this. This is very early work that one of my students has been working on. And what you're seeing here is it's a radiance field reconstruction of one particular time instant from this whole data that we captured. We're now looking at how to, first of all, as I said, dynamic radiance field methods are not yet very good, let alone process 600 hours of data, right? So they can barely process a few tens of seconds, right? So before we can actually analyze this data, we need to develop the methods that can operate on very long time sequences. Okay, so limitations of this work, n equals 1, right? So there is currently only one participant, so we can't generalize any findings from this to across the whole population. There are lots of privacy ethical considerations here. I'm happy to talk about this offline if you're interested. And we're still working with collaborators on figuring out how to best use this data. All right, so that brings me to the end of today's lecture. I know that some of you tried this, but if you haven't, I'd highly encourage you to download the code, read through the instructions, set up and try to train this with your own model. So that's something that you might want to do. And then finally, on Wednesday, we'll have the last lecture of the series, which is going to be on more advanced topics. What's the state of the art? I will make sure to include something about the hardware. But maybe I'll do a quick poll here. What other topics are you guys interested in? You could just shout out.
Incorporating priors.
Incorporating priors. Okay, so fewer cameras, incorporating priors. That's a good one. Yeah. Yeah.
And what you mentioned, monocular dynamics.
Monocular dynamic, yeah, I can talk about that as well. Yeah. Feed forward reconstruction, yeah, okay. That's very new, but I'll try to do my best. Yeah.
Has anybody ever tried to look into connectivity information from shape using a radiance field?
There might be some, yeah. Not that I am immediately familiar with, but I think I know of a couple of papers that do. Yeah, I can point you to the right direction.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's good. So I'll focus on like prior-based methods, maybe feed forward, and then hardware for capturing this kind of data.
Application in robotics.
Application in robotics. Okay, let's see how much I can try to cram into the last lecture. Okay, cool. Thank you, folks, and see you on Wednesday.